I'm Wendy Shearer. I'm Director of Partners and Ecosystems here at Pulsant, and I'm delighted to be hosting our second podcast in a series on data sovereignty. We're joined today by Kate Hanaghan from TechMarketView. Kate, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Before we jump into the topic, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your role that you have and a bit more about TechMarketView.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Chief Research Officer at TechMarketView. I'm an industry analyst by trade with a background looking at infrastructure services, which is why I think I'm here today. But aside from that, I run the Analyst team and I look after our research agenda, making sure that we write about the stuff that people want to hear about. TechMarketView is very focused on the UK, so we track the UK software and IT services market. We're talking to the buyers as well as the suppliers, and actually our sweet spot is in UK public sector, where we have lots of connections with government buyers and also advising the suppliers on how to work with the buyers so that everyone gets best value from the situation.
Yeah, I mean, we've met once before, Kate, and I remember when you managed to turn content around so quickly, and you're always moving from one thing to the next. So I've got huge respect for what you do. So as you say, we're here to talk specifically about data sovereignty as a subject. Just thinking about that, what does that mean? So how do you define data sovereignty? What does that mean in a UK context?
Data sovereignty is really about keeping control of your data. It's about knowing where your data is, who has access to it, and which regulations apply. So for business leaders, it's about having that discipline of making sure that your organisation remains the decision maker. So even when data sits in the cloud, for example, and moves amongst suppliers, you need to know what's really going on behind the scenes. And while there are some obvious examples in defence and finance, any organisation that relies heavily on customer data, operates internationally or puts data across multiple clouds, needs to be really switched on to what data sovereignty means for them as an organisation.
And I mean, you have the luxury of having a perspective over everything that's happening in the sort of technology industry because you're constantly reporting on it. So if we think sort of into the bigger picture, what are the kind of trends that you're seeing in the market right now?
You're right. We do watch this stuff day in, day out, and sometimes it can be pretty depressing. And we spend a lot of time kind of filtering through the masses of information and perspectives that are out there. I think if I talk a little bit first about some of the market conditions that we're seeing in UK tech and IT services, I mean, I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I think if you, as I've mentioned, one of our focus areas is the public sector. And it's a very important sector because it accounts for almost a quarter of all tech spend in the UK. And despite the latest public spending review being the most digitally focused that we've ever seen, if you look at investment by that sector over the next few years, I mean, it's hardly growing at all, despite the fact that digital is such an important part. We hear so much about how AI is going to save the government and make it much more efficient and effective. But if you look at what government's investing and able to invest, it doesn't all marry up. I think if you look more broadly at other sectors as well, there is a lot of intent to invest in digital. There are many organisations that would love to be able to put money behind AI, for example, and train up their staff and so on. And alongside that, we see lots of organisations that don't have the skills, they don't have the staff with the right combination of skills to be able to do that either. And while we're starting to see momentum creeping up around Gen AI and Agentic AI, this is not being funded by new spend. So there is a sense of urgency and an intent to want to invest in digitalization and data foundations. But there's also this intense need to balance innovation with cost optimization. And, there will always be exceptions. There will always be organizations that have got a ton of cash in the bank. But for most organizations, investing in innovation, that cash has got to come from somewhere. So when I talk to CIOs, they will still often talk about saving money and about cost optimization. That is still very much top of mind. So that's the kind of, I suppose, market conditions backdrop. If I pick out a few kind of market shaping trends that we're seeing right now, and there are probably 4 key ones that I think are relevant today. And the first is production scale AI. So, AI is not a side hustle anymore for most, and I think many have recognised that it's the engine of competitive advantage. And we're moving into this era of autonomous agentic systems. I mean, we've heard tons about agentic AI, haven't we, over the past few months in particular. And that sees organisations being able to hand decision-making over to AI and run these kind of multi-step processes from end to end. For service providers, for the IT service providers working in the market right now, this means a real change in mindset is required. So moving from just implementing tools to redesigning business processes around AI, it's a real shift, and we can see a difference between organisations that are able to think like that and aren't. And when I talk to CIOs, many of them don't want to just keep on seeing clever demos about what AI can do. They want the sort of transformation that's really going to stick. And I think the winners on both sides, buyers and suppliers, will be the firms that can really integrate AI deeply and consistently at scale. So that's number one. I think then number two, in terms of big trends that we're seeing, is what we call kind of platform business models. So the industry is shifting from these point solutions to connected, data-driven platforms. So these are platforms that take in cloud, data and AI, and use those platforms to deliver real outcomes. It's not about the point solutions. It's not about the technology. It's what it's able to achieve for the organisation that's adopting it. Infrastructure is really important here. It's there's the race for compute and capacity. That's you've got to have that underlying to enable these platforms to run. But they really are becoming the operating systems of modern businesses. So that's number two. So the third, and I know this is a subject close to your heart, is what we call the partnership imperative. No one wins alone anymore. Competitive advantage really comes from these ecosystems. It's not about the individual vendors. Partnerships are not a nice to have anymore. They are the product in many cases. And service providers, including the likes of Pulsant, need to become kind of orchestrators of those ecosystems, and bringing together, again, AI, data, cloud, security, but also the specialist skills to really make those ecosystems do something and at pace. And it's not a procurement exercise anymore. Ecosystems should be a board level point. It's so critical to the way that organisations, not just the IT service providers, but their customers as well. We see ecosystems just being so key at the moment. And then the fourth one that I would highlight is cybersecurity, but I think specifically as a business strategy. And when something goes wrong, when there's a breach, and I have to say, even at TechMarketView, it's the thing that keeps us awake at night. If our systems go down, we don't have a business. And actually, with AI, this raises the stakes even further, because AI is now inside everything, inside mission critical systems. So what we're seeing now is security by design. It's becoming kind of the baseline expectations, and it's a huge opportunity for service providers to get to put cyber into everything, into every service line. It's not something that just operates on the periphery anymore. It is the backbone of digital business. So they're the kind of 4 areas that I'd highlight alongside those market conditions, which are characterised, I would say, by a lot of uncertainty at the moment.
I don't know where to begin, Kate. There's so much in there. There's so much to unpack. I mean, I think some of my observations with the technology providers that we work with, we've definitely seen a lot of budgets being used on cyber. And what they're saying is that actually then they're coming to them saying, I need to use my budget. I need more of my budget to pay for cyber. So I need you to help me save cost. So actually the technology service providers are helping them in the cost saving initiatives that then in themselves can help fund some of the cyber initiatives. So I think that's quite interesting. And then the other bit I find is what we're seeing is we start the conversation with data sovereignty and we sort of start to pull that thread, and actually there's just so much more than the jurisdiction of where the data's held, right? Because actually this is all about data strategy and all those things that are then all the parts of the business that are so dependent on solid data foundations in order to deliver, to keep businesses running.
Absolutely. It's also intertwined, isn't it?
So lots to unpack there, Kate. That was, there's a lot in that. I guess against that sort of context of what you're seeing in the overall market, how does data sovereignty fit into that? What's the implications for data sovereignty really?
Well, the more that AI scales, the more platforms consolidate, the more suppliers kind of depend on these kind of web of partner ecosystems, the harder it becomes for organizations to maintain control over their data. And once AI moves into production and digital platforms become the backbone of operations, data unfortunately stops living in these neat, predictable places. It flows through, it's almost like water. It flows through clouds, through partners, through automated workflows. And it's often moving faster than governance frameworks can keep up with. And then you end up with what I call the invisible forms of lock-in. So in other words, in AI models, in data pipelines, or in platform integrations, they all become quietly embedded, and it becomes very difficult to start unwinding that if you want to start taking a step back. So even when technology is nominally open, the way suppliers, the way data sets and workflows interlock, it can make switching out of that really difficult. And it means that sovereignty has to be designed in from the very start in terms of architecture, in terms of contracts and governance. It can't just be assumed. You can't assume when you are engaging with your partners and clients, customers and so on, that data sovereignty is there. And it's a bit like I was saying about cyber earlier on, this idea of secure by design. It's the same with sovereignty. You want to make sure it's in there from the very beginning. And actually, cyber and sovereignty are themselves completely intertwined. A sovereign solution is only sovereign if it is genuinely secure.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And what you were talking about there in terms of a bit of vendor lock-in, that was one of the trends that we saw, I don't know, at least five or more years ago, as people were moving into public cloud environments and they were concerned that they were going to get kind of stuck there, and they were thinking about, trying to think ahead to where multi-cloud might come into play. So what are you seeing in terms of how the big sort of global hyperscalers and the big IT suppliers are responding to that?
Well, not surprisingly, all of the global suppliers, so think of the very big kind of software and hyperscaler names, they're all moving on this, and they're all moving very quickly. So I was talking to Google yesterday, for example. They've just opened their sovereign cloud hub in Munich. They're putting billions of dollars into new AI and cloud infrastructure across Europe. You got Microsoft, another big software company and hyperscaler. They're expanding their digital sovereignty controls and their EU data boundary services. And then AWS, the biggest hyperscaler, actually the biggest provider of software and IT services in the UK by quite a while. They've been building out their fully separate European sovereign cloud with all its own governance and major investment pipeline kind of backing that up. So the intent is very real, and the money is very much there.
So you talked quite a bit there, Kate, about the huge sums of money. I mean, the investment is massive that the hyperscalers are putting into sovereignty, and a lot of what you said was actually about investments going into Europe. How credible is that from a UK perspective? How is the market responding in the UK to the investments that they're making?
So, as you say, those hyperscaler sovereign cloud offerings are credible in intent, but the practicality, I think, depends on who you are as a buyer, as a partner, and what you need. The big players are clearly taking this very seriously. They're investing billions, as you say, opening these sovereign hubs, adding data boundary controls and building new governance models. This is immense. There is a lot of resource going into this. But the reality for UK buyers, I think, is a bit more nuanced. Now, for UK organisations, I think especially those operating entirely within the UK, that I think the key question becomes, what level of sovereignty do you actually need, and which workloads? Fully sovereign cloud might be essential for highly sensitive data or specific regulatory requirements, but it's unnecessary, and quite frankly, it's very expensive for everything else. So yes, these offerings are very credible, and for the right use cases, they are absolutely practical, but they're not one size fits all. So you as a buyer of these services need to do is you need to match the workload to the right environment and be really clear about what you're paying for and why.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. Exactly as you said, it's not one size fits all. So it's almost like, what's the most appropriate platform for a particular workload or particular application, depending on what they need, where it needs to be held, what the performance attributes are, and so on. Whereas I think previously it was almost making the decision about the platform as a catch-all for everything, and now it really seems much more of a mixed environment.
I think actually that idea of becoming much more specific, becoming much more precise around what you're using workloads for and how they relate to the sector that you're in and the company that you are, I think is a very broad theme that we're seeing. Everything is becoming more precise, more specific. And I think if you are a supplier to organisations, you've got to be able to understand their sector. You've got to be able to understand their workloads. It's got to be that level of detail in order to be, I think, the best supplier, the best partner that you possibly can be.
I think that is a brilliant point, Kate. And you talked earlier about like the impact of AI on processes. And in order to change the processes, you need to fundamentally understand the sector, the business, and what they're working in, right? Whereas previously it was, well, it's data, it's tech, and it was it was nice. It was a nice to have,
absolutely.
But now it's absolutely a have to have, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Kate, one of the things that you talked about at the beginning was just all the trends that you see in the market, and that's the place that you have. It must be so fascinating because you watch all these different trends come in, and some that leave and some that stay. What's your thoughts? Is data sovereignty a trend, or is it something that's here for the long term?
It's certainly not just a hype cycle. It is something much more fundamental is shifting. We're seeing organisations who are responding to a real pressure. You've got AI everywhere. You've got global supply chains, which are all interlinked. You've got regulation tightening across industries, and you've got data moving in different ways. So sovereignty is a conversation that it isn't just noise. It's a response to a world where control, trust, and transparency suddenly matter a lot more than they used to. However, I think if you are a UK-based organisation, you might be less swept up in it all, or less concerned perhaps, possibly with the exception of a certain regulated industry and perhaps government. So depending on where you're based and what you do, I think you'll feel that this is more or less a pressing subject matter.
So here to stay.
Yeah.
So if you are a CISO or an IT director or even a chief executive of a company, given how fundamental this is across everything, where do people start? What should they be looking for from a data sovereignty perspective?
I think if you're one of those senior IT decision makers, you've got to start by looking for real transparency. And I think that means understanding or asking the questions around where data actually travels to, who can touch it, which laws apply, and how everything is monitored and audited. I think there's some of the very kind of practical things that you need to understand. I think there's also this need to understand the operational reality. So not just, what does the brochure say about this data sovereignty offering, but how is access controlled day to day? What happens if the provider changes their terms? And crucially, how easy is it to move away from this or to exit if you really need to? And I think finally, those senior IT decision makers should look for real evidence, not just promises from the provider, but where's the evidence? Where are the independent certifications? Where's the governance that really enables them as senior decision makers to go back to their regulator, to go back to their own board, and to be able to really understand and explain what is going to happen to the data?
I think you make a really good point. So we see that in two ways. We see our direct clients come in and asking us for that sort of information so that we are being transparent about the platforms that we provide. But then what we're also seeing is because we have a lot of service providers, technology providers building their solutions on our digital infrastructure, then if you think about the impact of that transparency from a supply chain perspective. So we need to then give the technology providers the transparency about where the data is held and processed on our platforms.
Yep.
They then need to bake that into the information that they provide to their clients about the products and services. So I think it has a big material impact on the amount of information that needs to be made available and at all levels of the supply chain.
It is hugely complex, and there are many opportunities for things to go wrong.
Yeah.
And when things go wrong, they really go wrong. And it's on the BBC. It's it's in the mainstream. It's in the mainstream press. I think there's a lot of pressure on service providers, including Pulsant and those in your ecosystem, to get it right. And I think quite rightly, because there is an awful lot resting on this now. There is, things are so much more complicated now. Data is everywhere. AI is everywhere. It's a very complex landscape. And quite rightly, it should come back to the service providers, to the tech companies, to make sure that they've crossed every T and dotted every I.
Great point. So we've talked about how the hyperscalers are thinking about data sovereignty and how they're responding to the pressure to then be transparent and to have sovereign offerings. How do people get that balance between some of the hyperscalers, some of the private cloud entities, hybrid? What's that? How do you navigate around that?
Yeah, so I think for those senior IT decision makers that have this issue that they need to tackle, I think those types of decision makers with those types of budgets should always start with the workload. Start with the workload, not the technology. So look at the risk, look at the sensitivity, look at the business impact of each piece of data and process. Plenty of workloads are perfectly suited to public cloud, which is hugely scalable, very cost effective mostly, and very low risk. Some workloads need a hybrid approach because they touch regulated data or critical operations. And only a very small, very sensitive set of workloads genuinely need sovereign infrastructure. So the point is not to pick one model and force everything onto it. It's to match the environment to the job. So you get the right mix of control. You get the right cost and flexibility without having to over-engineer the entire estate. It really is about being pragmatic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We used to talk about, cloud appropriate and things in the past, and it feels like it's sort of sovereign appropriate. Which bits do you need? As you say, if you take a workload-centric approach, where does it need to sit? And also, I think that has an impact on the technology service providers, because they might want to be able to offer hyperscale cloud, but also for their clients, but also be able to offer solutions that give them private cloud as well, and then they can help them navigate between
That's it.
the two.
Yeah.
We're certainly seeing as, and I guess that goes back to the ecosystem concept. We're seeing people who are maybe specialists in public cloud, but now they want to they don't want to lose their specialism, but they want to kind of buddy up with someone who can then offer private cloud, so that they don't then lose those clients who are then looking to move some of those workloads as appropriate into private cloud platforms. So people are having to navigate, because they want to keep working with those clients that they've built up over a long period of time.
Yes.
They need to evolve their solutions and their portfolio to accommodate that. And so I think that goes back to your point about ecosystems.
Absolutely spot on. Yeah.
So let's just talk a little bit more about that term there, pragmatic sovereignty. What do you mean by that?
Pragmatic sovereignty is about making smart case-by-case decisions. So it means putting the right data in the right place for the right reason, not locking everything down by default. So some data needs really tight control. Some can sit on those global platforms, but most sit somewhere in between. It's a way to stay in control of your data without really slowing the business down. And buyers should work with their suppliers to help define what should sit where, but also importantly, what the cost implications of that are.
Yeah, and you're talking about buyers and suppliers there. So let's just evolve that out into thinking about the ecosystem, because you started out when you were looking at the trends. Yeah. The ecosystem is a big trend. So how do ecosystems support these sort of data sovereign environments?
So like most things in tech now, sovereignty is a symphony, not a solo. And that's a phrase at TechMarketView we've been using for many years. It really does apply across the board. So it isn't a single product. Data sovereignty is not a single product. It is a combination of capabilities. So you need cloud, you need AI, you need security, connectivity, compliance, and you need the skills as well. And no single vendor can deliver all of that to the level that the customers need. So ecosystems matter because they let organizations assemble and tailor sovereignty. I think that's really important. You don't just buy it. You don't buy data sovereignty off the shelf. Yeah. And importantly, that gives buyers choice. So they're not locked in to one supplier's interpretation of what data center means. You open your organization up to a curated ecosystem of specialists that can tend to your every need.
So Kate, we've talked about so much today, and there is so much kind of noise in this space. So for any of the listeners or viewers who kind of don't know where to start, what sort of advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I think three things matter. So firstly, I think you need to map your dependency. So not just where the data lives, but who your critical services depend on. So the platforms, the partners, and so on. And this is how you start to spot those invisible lock-ins that I spoke about earlier, those hidden points of reliance that start to creep in. Second, design for sovereignty from the very start. So put simple rules in place around how data is handled. Make sure your tools and your models can move if they ever need to, kind of switch provider. Bake clear exit routes into your contracts. So I think building your system so that parts can be swapped without, having to rebuild everything. And then I think third and finally, push your suppliers to work harder. Ask them to prove how they can separate your data, what their lineage controls look like, and how easily they can move you away if you need to. Make sovereignty part of the procurement conversation from the very beginning. I think there are lots of practical aspects to bringing data sovereignty into the way that you operate. There's an awful lot to think about. And as I said previously, the key is having the right suppliers on your side the right ecosystem of suppliers that can really help you address all of those very difficult questions that you're going to need to unfortunately tackle.
Thank you so much for coming. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I hope you found that useful. If you want more information on our partner ecosystem or data sovereignty, there's loads of great resources on our website. We'd love to get your feedback and to hear more ideas for future podcasts, and we hope to see you again next time.